The streets of Birmingham, England, were filled with people on the day the world said goodbye to Ozzy Osbourne. Fans came from nearby towns, other parts of the country, and even from different countries just to be present. Some wore old Black Sabbath shirts that had faded over the years, while others held flowers, records, or handmade signs with simple messages like, "Thank you, Ozzy," or "Forever the Prince of Darkness." To many people, this was not just a funeral of a famous musician. It felt like the farewell of someone who belonged to the city itself. Birmingham was where Ozzy was born, where he grew up in a working-class family, and where his journey into music first began. That connection was clearly visible in the crowd. People were quiet but emotional, standing shoulder to shoulder, sharing stories with strangers about the first time they heard Black Sabbath or the moment Ozzy's music helped them through a hard time. While news headlines focused on the size of the crowd and the famous name attached to the event, there was much more happening that cameras did not fully capture. Small moments, personal gestures, and quiet decisions made by the family gave the funeral a deeper meaning. This was not designed to be a dramatic spectacle. It was meant to be honest, human, and true to who Ozzy really was. For years, Ozzy had spoken openly about death, aging, and illness. He never pretended to be invincible. When he passed away peacefully at the age of 76 after years of health struggles, his family made it clear that they wanted to respect his wishes. Ozzy did not want people to be overly sad. He wanted his life to be celebrated, not mourned in silence. That idea shaped everything that followed, from the music that played in the streets to the way the procession moved through meaningful parts of the city. Every detail reflected the life of a man who never fit into neat boxes. Ozzy was wild, funny, flawed, and deeply loved. The public saw the loud side of him for decades, but this farewell revealed a quieter truth. It showed how much he meant not just as a rock star, but as a husband, a father, and a symbol of survival. While many people thought they had seen everything through photos and videos online, the real story of Ozzy Osbourne's funeral was found in the details people barely noticed. Those details would later change how many fans understood the final goodbye. To understand why Ozzy Osbourne's funeral felt so personal, it helps to look at the final years of his life. Ozzy had been open about his health problems long before his death. In 2020, he shared that he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a condition that slowly affected his movement and strength. On top of that, injuries from a serious fall in 2019 caused long-term spinal problems that required multiple surgeries. Over time, his mobility became more limited, and by the last year of his life, he often used a wheelchair and needed full-time care at home. Despite these challenges, Ozzy never fully stepped away from the music or from his fans. He continued to speak honestly in interviews, sometimes with humor and sometimes with frustration, about what it was like to lose control over his body while his mind remained sharp. Those close to him said his final months were quiet but meaningful. He spent most of his time at home in Buckinghamshire with his wife Sharon and their children. Friends and longtime collaborators were said to have visited privately, knowing time was limited. Ozzy reportedly said his goodbyes in his own way, without drama or public statements. Just weeks before his passing, he made one final public appearance at a farewell concert in Birmingham. That moment was deeply symbolic. Ozzy performed while seated, but his voice and presence still filled the venue. Many fans in attendance felt they were witnessing history. The concert was not about perfection. It was about closure. Ozzy wanted to end his career on his own terms, in the city where it all began. After that night, he returned home and stayed out of the public eye. When he passed away peacefully, the family chose not to rush into announcements or media appearances. They informed close friends first, then released a statement confirming the news. Almost immediately, fans gathered outside his home and in Birmingham, leaving flowers and messages in silence. From the beginning, Sharon Osbourne made it clear that Ozzy's funeral would reflect who he was. He had often joked that he did not want a boring funeral, and that people should play his music and remember the good times. According to those close to the family, Ozzy had even helped plan parts of the farewell. He chose songs, rejected the idea of a traditional church service, and asked that nothing feel fake or staged. This approach shaped both the public procession and the private moments that followed. While the world expected something grand and dramatic, What actually happened was far more emotional in a quiet way. The focus was not on speeches or big displays, but on presence, memory, and respect. This decision made the funeral feel less like a performance and more like a shared human experience. And as the day unfolded, it became clear that some of the most powerful moments were the ones no one had planned to notice. The public funeral procession in Birmingham was the moment when Ozzy Osbourne's farewell truly became a shared experience between the family and the city. On the morning of the procession, roads were closed and police were stationed along the planned route, not to control the crowd but to protect the flow of the event. The route itself was carefully chosen. It began in Aston, the neighborhood where Ozzy grew up, a place that shaped his early life and working-class attitude. From there, it moved to the heart of the city toward Broad Street, passing landmarks connected to his personal and musical journey. Fans gathered hours in advance, some standing quietly, others playing Black Sabbath songs softly from small speakers. When the black hearse finally appeared, the crowd reacted with a mix of applause, cheers, and tears. It was not a moment of chaos, but one of recognition. People understood they were witnessing the final ride of someone who had carried their city's name across the world. Flowers were thrown gently onto the road. Handwritten notes were held high, and some fans simply bowed their heads as the hearse passed. One of the most striking parts of the procession was how natural everything felt. There were no loud announcements or forced moments. Chants of Ozzy's name rose and fell on their own, echoing through the streets without direction. Near Villa Park, the stadium of Ozzy's favorite football club, fans sang the team's anthem, blending sports, music, and local pride into one emotional moment. A small brass band played a slow version of Iron Man, turning a heavy metal anthem into something gentle and reflective. For many watching, this was when the reality truly settled in. This was not just the loss of a celebrity. It was the loss of a hometown hero. The Osbourne family followed the hearse in separate vehicles, keeping a respectful distance. They chose not to walk the route themselves, allowing the city to have its moment without distraction. This decision spoke volumes. It showed trust in the fans and respect for the bond between Ozzy and Birmingham. Along the route, vendors sold unofficial shirts and posters, and while some criticized this, most people ignored it. For them, being present mattered more than appearances. As the procession neared its end, the mood shifted. The noise softened, voices lowered. People stopped cheering and began singing quietly or standing in silence. Flowers piled up near the Black Sabbath bridge, and city workers were instructed to leave them untouched for days. This was not a polished event, and that was exactly why it felt real. It was messy, emotional, and deeply human. The city was not trying to impress the world. It was simply saying goodbye in its own language. Music, memory, and unfiltered emotion filled the streets, creating a farewell that felt true to the man at the center of it all. While the public procession showed the scale of Ozzy Osbourne's impact, the most emotional moment came later at the Black Sabbath Bridge. This location had long been a place of meaning for fans, marked by a bench and plaque dedicated to Ozzy's legacy. As the crowd thinned and the noise faded, the Osbourne family arrived for a quiet, deeply personal tribute. Sharon Osbourne was the first to step forward. Dressed in black and wearing dark sunglasses, she moved slowly, holding a bouquet of purple flowers. Those close to her described this moment as one she prepared for emotionally, even if nothing could truly make it easier. She placed the flowers on the bench, removed her sunglasses, and stood still for several seconds. Cameras captured her hands trembling slightly as she touched the back of the bench, a simple gesture that carried enormous weight. It was not a performance. It was a private goodbye happening in a public place. One by one, the children followed. Jack placed a folded letter on the bench, said to be a personal message to his father that was never meant to be read by anyone else. Kelly sat briefly beside the flowers, resting her hand on the wood, whispering something only she would ever know. Amy and Lewis added their own quiet tributes, each gesture small but meaningful. There were no speeches, no microphones, and no announcements. The entire moment lasted only a few minutes, but it became the emotional center of the day. What many people did not notice at first was a detail that later caught widespread attention. Sharon was wearing a thin gold chain around her neck, and hanging from it was Ozzy's wedding ring. This was not just a piece of jewelry. According to those close to the family, It was the ring exchanged during their vow renewal years earlier, a symbol of survival after difficult times. Sharon did not point it out or speak about it, but she did not hide it either. That quiet choice spoke louder than any statement could have. It showed a bond that endured through illness, public struggles, and decades of life in the spotlight. Another detail that stood out was Jack's behavior throughout the day. He stayed close to Sharon, guiding her gently, adjusting her coat, and creating space when photographers pressed too near. Friends later shared that Jack had taken on a protective role in the final weeks of Ozzy's life, handling arrangements and making sure his mother was supported. Kelly, while more reserved during the event, shared her grief later through a simple social media post, choosing silence over explanation. Together, these small moments formed a picture that many people miss at first. The funeral was not about shocking revelations or dramatic gestures. It was about loyalty, love, and the quiet ways people carry grief. In the end, what stayed with fans was not the size of the crowd or the headlines, but the image of a family saying goodbye in their own way, honoring Ozzy Osbourne not just as a legend, but as a husband and father. After the public procession and the emotional moment at the Black Sabbath Bridge, the focus slowly shifted from the streets of Birmingham to the wider world. News of Ozzy Osbourne's funeral spread quickly across social media, television, and news sites, and reactions began pouring in from every corner of the globe. Musicians, actors, athletes, and everyday fans shared memories that showed just how deep Ozzy's influence ran. For many artists, Ozzy was not just a performer they admired, but a reason they picked up an instrument in the first place. Former bandmates from Black Sabbath expressed their grief in simple but powerful ways. Tony Iommi shared a photo from their final days together and described Ozzy as irreplaceable, a word that appeared again and again in tributes from those who knew him personally. Geezer Butler chose a quieter approach, staying away from interviews and allowing fans to speak through their own memories. Outside the band, voices from across the rock and metal world joined in. James Hetfield called Ozzy a blueprint for heavy music, while others described him as a door opener who made it possible for entire genres to exist. What stood out was the tone of these messages. There was admiration, but there was also gratitude. Many artists spoke about Ozzy's kindness behind the scenes, his encouragement of younger musicians, and his ability to laugh at himself even when his fame reached unbelievable levels. Back in the United Kingdom, city officials in Birmingham recognized Ozzy not just as a musician, but as a cultural figure who helped shape the city's identity. Plans were announced for permanent tributes, including murals and preserved landmarks along the funeral route. Fans continued to gather at the Black Sabbath Bridge, leaving candles, photos, and handwritten letters long after the official events ended. City workers were instructed to let these tributes remain for several days, allowing the community time to grieve in its own way. Around the world, fans organized their own memorials. In Los Angeles, people gathered outside the Rainbow Bar and Grill, a place closely linked to Ozzy's life during his years in the United States. In Tokyo, fans displayed artwork and played his music late into the night. In cities across Europe and South America, radio stations dedicated hours to Black Sabbath and Ozzy's solo work. These global reactions showed something important. Ozzy Osbourne's funeral was not just an end. It was a reminder of how far his music had traveled and how many lives it had touched. Even people who had never met him felt a sense of loss, as if a familiar voice had gone silent. While the world continued to speak, the Osbourne family chose a different path. They stepped away from the spotlight, making it clear that the public tribute was complete. Everything that followed would be private. This contrast between global noise and family silence highlighted the balance Ozzy had always lived with. A man who thrived on attention also understood the value of stepping back. In death, as in life, he managed to do both. Behind the scenes, plans were already in motion for a private farewell that would be very different from a public event in Birmingham. According to sources close to the Osbourne family, Ozzy had been clear about what he wanted long before his passing. He did not want a second funeral that felt staged or formal. Instead, he asked for something small, quiet, and honest. This private service was meant to belong only to those who truly knew him, away from cameras, crowds, and expectations. The location was kept confidential, though it was believed to be near the family's home in Buckinghamshire, possibly a small private chapel or on nearby land. Invitations were limited to immediate family, longtime friends, and a handful of trusted associates. There would be no public program, no dress code, and no press access. This was described as a hard rule, not a request. Sharon Osbourne was said to be personally overseeing every detail, making sure her husband's wishes were respected. Those close to her described this process as both painful and grounding. After decades of public life, she wanted this final moment to be something that belonged only to the family. Each of the children was expected to play a role in the private farewell. Jack, who had taken on many responsibilities in the final weeks of Ozzy's life, was preparing to read from a book that held special meaning to his father. Kelly, whose musical connection with Ozzy was well known, may have chosen to sing a short, private tribute, though nothing was planned as a performance. Amy, who had always preferred to stay out of the public eye, was expected to bring a handwritten letter or a personal item to leave with the casket. Lewis, quiet and steady throughout the public events, remained close to Sharon, helping her through the planning process without drawing attention to himself. The burial itself was expected to take place immediately after the service on private land. Ozzy had expressed that he did not want to be buried in a public cemetery or any place that could turn into a tourist destination. He wanted somewhere peaceful, where his family could visit without intrusion. There would be no filming, no photos, and no official statements afterward. For the family, this final step was about closure. While the world would continue to talk about Ozzy Osbourne for years to come, this moment would exist only in memory. It was a final act of control from a man who had spent much of his life being watched, judged, and misunderstood. In choosing privacy, the Osbournes honored not just a legend, but the person behind it. As fans look back on the public funeral and the quiet details that emerged later, many realized that nothing about this farewell was truly shocking. Instead, it was deeply human. And in that honesty, it may have been the most fitting goodbye Ozzy Osbourne could have asked for. Days passed after Ozzy Osbourne's funeral. Something interesting began to happen. The loud headlines slowly faded, but the quieter conversations grew stronger. Fans started sharing personal stories instead of just photos from the procession. Online forums filled with messages from people who had never met Ozzy but felt deeply connected to him. Many talked about listening to Black Sabbath during difficult times in their lives, while others remembered Ozzy's solo songs playing in their childhood homes. These reflections showed that Ozzy's influence went far beyond music charts or stage performances. He had become a companion to millions, someone whose voice felt familiar even across generations. What stood out in these conversations was how often people mentioned his honesty. Ozzy never tried to present himself as perfect. He spoke openly about addiction, mistakes, health struggles, and fear. That openness made fans feel less alone in their own struggles. In that sense, the funeral felt less like the end of a career and more like the closing of a shared chapter for many people. Media analysts later noted that the most shared images from the funeral were not wide shots of crowd, but close-ups of small moments. Sharon standing quietly at the bench, Jack guiding his mother through the crowd, flowers piling up beneath the Black Sabbath bridge. These images carried more emotional weight than any speech ever could. They reminded people that behind the legend was a family dealing with loss in the same way any family does. Some fans admitted they initially clicked on coverage expecting something dramatic or controversial. Instead, they stayed because what they saw felt real. The absence of scandal became the story. There were no arguments, no public breakdowns, no shocking revelations, just people grieving honestly. This surprised many viewers, especially those used to celebrity funerals turning into media spectacles. In Ozzy's case, restraint became powerful. It forced people to slow down and reflect rather than react. Music critics also pointed out how fitting the farewell was for someone like Ozzy. His life had been loud, chaotic, and unpredictable, yet his goodbye was controlled and thoughtful. That contrast added depth to his legacy. Younger fans, some discovering his music for the first time because of the funeral coverage, began exploring his work online. Streaming numbers for Black Sabbath and Ozzy solo albums rose sharply in the weeks following his death. Songs like Changes, Mama, I'm Coming Home, and Iron Man found new audiences who connected with the emotion behind the music more than the image of the performer. This renewed interest showed that Ozzy's story was far from over. It was simply being retold through a new lens. Even people who had once judged him harshly began reconsidering their views. They saw a man who had faced his failures, owned his past, and remained devoted to his family until the end. In that way, the funeral served as a kind of final statement, not spoken aloud but felt. It suggested that legacy is not built only through success, but through honesty, endurance, and the way one leaves the world behind. Looking back, what people truly miss about Ozzy Osbourne's funeral was not a hidden secret or dramatic twist, but a deeper message woven quietly into every part of the day. The funeral showed that even the most famous lives end in moments that are small and personal. Despite decades of fame, controversy, and larger-than-life stories, Ozzy's farewell centered on family, place, and memory. Birmingham was not chosen because it looked good on camera, but because it mattered to him. The Black Sabbath Bridge was not a backdrop, but a symbol of where his journey began. Sharon's choice to wear Ozzy's ring on a chain was not meant to create headlines, yet it became one of the most powerful images from the day. It showed love continuing beyond presence, connection beyond words. Jack's quiet support of his mother reflected responsibility and growth, reminding people that grief often reshapes family roles in unexpected ways. Kelly's silence spoke just as loudly as any public tribute could have. Together, these details formed a story that unfolded slowly, rewarding those who paid attention. In many ways, the funeral challenged how people think about celebrity culture. It suggested that fame does not remove the need for privacy, and that the most meaningful moments are often the least visible. By limiting interviews and refusing to turn grief into content, the Osbourne family drew a clear boundary. That boundary allowed the public tribute to exist without consuming the private one. Fans respected that choice, perhaps because it felt consistent with Ozzy's own contradictions. He loved attention, but valued authenticity. He was outrageous on stage, but deeply loyal at home. His final goodbye reflected both sides. As time moves on, Ozzy Osbourne will continue to be remembered for his music, his influence on heavy metal, and his unforgettable presence. But those who follow the funeral closely may remember something else just as strongly. They will remember how quietly it ended. No grand final speech. No dramatic farewell performance. Just a city standing still, a family holding together, and a legacy left to echo on its own. In the end, what people missed was not shocking at all. It was simple. Ozzy Osbourne left the world the same way many people hope to someday, surrounded by love, remembered honestly, and allowed to rest without noise. And perhaps that is why the farewell stayed with so many people. It did not demand attention. It earned it as the weeks moved on and life slowly returned to normal in Birmingham. Traces of Ozzy Osbourne's farewell remain visible in small but meaningful ways. Flowers at the Black Sabbath Bridge dried in the summer air, handwritten notes curled at the edges, and candles melted down to their final stubs. Yet people kept coming. Some visited alone early in the morning. Others arrived in small groups, standing quietly before moving on. There was no rush to clear the space, and that seemed intentional. The city understood that grief does not follow a schedule. For many locals, Ozzy was not just a global star, but someone who represented possibility. He showed that a kid from a working-class neighborhood could change music history without changing who he was at the core. That idea resonated strongly in the days after the funeral. Teachers spoke about him in classrooms. Parents played his music for their children, and radio hosts shared lesser-known stories that highlighted his humor and humility. What also became clear was how carefully the Osbourne family had protected the meaning of the farewell. By refusing to over-explain or defend their choices, they allowed the event to speak for itself. There were no follow-up interviews breaking down emotions, no exclusive statements revealing private details. This silence was not cold. It was respectful. It allowed fans to interpret what they saw through their own experiences. In a time when everything is often explained instantly and repeatedly, that restraint felt refreshing. It reminded people that not every moment needs commentary to be meaningful. Many fans later admitted that the funeral changed how they viewed Ozzy. Some had only known him through headlines, reality television, or exaggerated stories. Seeing the calm dignity and love surrounding his final goodbye revealed a fuller picture. It showed a man who had lived loudly, but learned how to let go quietly. This contrast added depth to his legacy. It made his story feel complete rather than unfinished. Even critics who had once dismissed him acknowledged that his influence could not be denied. More importantly, they saw that influence reflected not just in music, but in people. The way fans respected boundaries, the way the city responded with patience rather than spectacle, and the way the family centered meaning over attention all pointed to a shared understanding. Ozzy Osbourne mattered, not because he was perfect, but because he was real. The funeral became a lesson without trying to be one. It showed that authenticity leaves a stronger mark than image, and that even in death, a person's values continue to guide the way they are remembered. Long after the last headline faded, those who were present, either in person or through careful observation, carried something with them, a sense that they had witnessed not just the end of a life, but the closing of a story told honestly, without noise and without regret. In the end, the reason Ozzy Osbourne's funeral stayed with so many people was not because of anything shocking, but because of what it quietly revealed. It showed that behind the legend, there was a man who understood who he was and what mattered most. He did not try to rewrite his past or hide his struggles. Instead, he allowed his life to be remembered as it was: complicated, loud, painful at times, but deeply meaningful. The farewell reflected that truth. It did not attempt to control public emotion, only to guide it gently. Fans were invited to participate, but not to intrude. The family was visible, but not exposed. Every part of the day struck a careful balance between sharing and protecting. That balance is rare, especially in the world of fame. As time passes, Ozzy's music will continue to play. New fans will discover his work. Old fans will revisit it with fresh emotion, and his influence will remain woven into the fabric of rock and metal history. But for those who follow the funeral closely, there will always be another memory tied to his name. The image of a city pausing. The sound of voices chanting not in chaos, but in respect. The sight of a wife carrying her husband's ring close to her heart. These moments did not need explanation. They carried their meaning naturally. Perhaps that is what people truly missed at first glance. The funeral was not designed to shock or surprise. It was designed to feel true. And in a world often driven by spectacle, truth can feel unexpected. Ozzy Osbourne's final goodbye did not ask for attention. It earned it through sincerity. It reminded people that even